Death isn't supposed to smile. Death isn't supposed to look peaceful or alive. And yet, in the Victorian era, thousands of families owned photographs where the dead seemed to be simply resting, eyes calm, posture relaxed, almost breathing. To us, these images feel unsettling, but to the Victorians, they were acts of love and acts of illusion. Today, in part 3 of our series, we are going behind the camera, into the studios in hidden workshops, into the secrets photographers rarely spoke about, because their job wasn't to capture death, but to hide it. These are the hidden techniques that allowed Victorian photographers to make the dead look alive. Welcome back to Unknown Now, where we explore the forgotten, the mysterious, and the stories history tried to bury. Let's begin. In the Victorian era, death was an unwelcome but familiar visitor. Illnesses with no cure, infections that spread quickly, fatal accidents, and dangerous childbirth meant many families faced loss again and again. And tragically, many children did not live long enough to ever have their photograph taken while alive. So when someone passed away, the family often called a photographer, sometimes within hours. A post-mortem portrait might be the first and only image they would ever have. But families did not want a harsh reminder of death. They wanted a final moment frozen in time, a memory captured as if the person were still with them. And so photographers became more than technicians. They became illusionists, crafting images filled with warmth where none remained. One of the biggest myths about Victorian post-mortem photography is that photographers would stand the dead upright using strange metal stands. Those stands did exist, but they weren't used for the dead. They were created to keep living people still during long exposures. For the deceased, photographers used different and much more discreet methods. They used head clamps that rested behind the neck or skull, hidden under hair or shadows. Wooden or metal supports were placed behind chairs, allowing a body to lean upright without collapsing. For children, they often chose a bed or cushioned surface, covering the body with blankets so the supports remained invisible. Small braces or folded cloths were tucked under sleeves to keep arms lifted in natural positions. The trick wasn't to force the body to stand, but to hide every support so completely that the illusion of life felt effortless. The best photographers were both artists and engineers. But the pose mattered just as much as the supports. Families didn't want the image of a stiff, lifeless figure. They wanted something peaceful, something comforting. And so the sleeping pose became one of the most common arrangements, especially for children. It was simple, gentle, and hid the physical signs of death. Photographers would position the body before rigor mortis took hold, arranging the hands gently over the chest or beside the body. Limbs were curved, not rigid. Pillows, blankets, and soft fabrics were added to create a sense of rest. If the subject was a child, toys, flowers, or small keepsakes were placed beside them to add innocence and warmth. To grieving parents, these photos were often less a reminder of death and more a final image of peace, a way to imagine their child sleeping. Lighting was another essential part of the illusion. Early photography required long exposure times and bright lighting. This worked in favor of photographers working with unmoving subjects. But the challenge wasn't movement. The challenge was appearance. Death drains the face of color and collapses the features. So photographers learned to use light in a way that concealed these changes. They placed the subject near large windows, letting soft natural light smooth the skin and create a gentle glow. They used shadows intentionally, turning the face slightly to hide hollow eyes or sharp lines. They avoided overhead lighting that could highlight sunken areas. By brightening one side of the face and letting the other fall into soft shadows, they created a lifelike warmth that suggested breath and softness. Lighting became a kind of visual makeup, shaping the face into an image the family could cherish. But even with perfect posing and lighting, The final illusion often came from what happened after the photograph was taken. Victorian photographers were skilled retouchers and artists. They used pencils, brushes, and pigments to enhance the images once they had been developed. One of the most striking and haunting techniques was painting eyes directly onto the photograph. If the eyes were closed or appeared lifeless, the artist could draw pupils, irises, and even small highlights to mimic reflected light, making the subject appear awake. They added pink tones to the cheeks to counteract pallor. They softened harsh lines around the mouth or eyes. In some cases, entire backgrounds were drawn in or painted in to elevate the image to a studio-quality portrait. These techniques were not meant to deceive in a malicious way, they were meant to honor. A family wanted to remember someone as they lived, not as they died. And the photographer provided that final gift. When all of these techniques came together, the effect could be astonishing. A body that had passed away hours earlier could appear peaceful and strangely lifelike. The clothing was carefully arranged, often the best garments the person owned. Hidden supports held them gently upright or rested them softly against bedding. Lighting smoothed away the signs of death. The pose suggested sleep, rest, or quiet contemplation. And retouching added the final subtle touches of life, the faint glow of cheeks, the brightness of eyes, the softness of expression. Families would often keep these portraits framed in their homes, not as grim reminders, but as cherished memories of a loved one preserved at their best. To them, these photographs were precious, intimate, and deeply meaningful. To us today, these images may seem eerie or unsettling, but to the Victorians, they were an important part of mourning, remembrance, and love. Photography was rare and expensive. Many people never had a single portrait taken in their lifetime. A post-mortem photograph was often the only way to capture a person's likeness forever. And in a world where death was common and grief was a familiar companion, these images provided comfort. They offered a sense of closure. They gave families something to hold on to when life offered nothing else. Victorian post-mortem photography remains one of the most fascinating and mysterious traditions in the history of photography. A blend of grief and artistry, of technology and tenderness. The techniques, hidden stands, careful posing, sculpted lighting, painted retouching, were all designed with one purpose: to make the dead look alive one last time. Thank you for joining me for part 3 of this series. If you missed the first 2 episodes, I encourage you to watch them and explore how this tradition began and why it shaped an entire era of mourning. Let me know in the comments which technique surprised you the most. And as always, stay curious, stay aware, and keep seeking the mysteries hidden in our world. This is Unknown Now. Until next time.